The late 1980s. The Soviet Union is cracking at the seams, but in Kharkiv, a group of designers is working on a project that was supposed to bury all Western tank developments. A vehicle with characteristics that sound like nonsense from a science fiction movie. Protection against which any NATO shells are powerless. Firepower capable of turning an Abrams into a heap of scrap metal with the first shot. And a layout so insane that even experienced tank crews twirled their fingers at their temples. The project was led by the son of the legendary Alexander Morozov, the man who created the T-34. Evgeny Morozov set himself the task of creating a tank where the crew would survive any hit. But to do this, he had to break all the rules of tank building, and the result was a monster the world had never seen. The 80s were a time when Soviet tank building hit a concrete wall. 3 main battle tanks were in service, the T-64, T-72, and T-80. All of them were relatively cheap, mass-produced, and technologically advanced. All had a classic layout, the driver in front, a turret with 2 crew members in the middle, and the engine in the back. And all had one critical problem that the military did not like to discuss out loud. The crew had practically no chance of survival if the armor was penetrated. The reason was simple and terrible at the same time. In Soviet tanks, everything was located in one cramped space. 3 people, an ammunition load of 40 shells, fuel tanks, and the engine. Designers squeezed out every centimeter, creating compact, low-profile vehicles. This gave an advantage. The tank was harder to detect and more difficult to hit. But when a shell penetrated the armor, it encountered not empty space, but a tightly packed compartment where ammunition lay and fuel sloshed right next to people. The result was predictable. The detonation of the ammunition load turned the tank into a mass grave in a fraction of a second. Western designers also knew about this problem. The American Abrams Moan, the British Challenger, the German Leopard 2. All of them were much larger than Soviet tanks. In them, the crew was placed in an isolated compartment. The ammunition was stored in a special turret bustle with blowout panels. Upon detonation, the blast wave went outward, not inward. The tankers lost the vehicle but stayed alive. Soviet tankers did not have such a luxury, while the Swedes went their own way entirely and created the turretless STRV-103, a tank destroyer with a fixed gun, where crew survivability was ensured by a low silhouette and sloped armor. But Soviet generals needed a full-fledged tank, not a compromise. By the mid-80s, this became a critical problem. NATO anti-tank weapons were becoming increasingly powerful. New shaped charge shells, guided missiles, and sub-caliber ammunition with uranium cores. All of this penetrated Soviet armor at distances of 2 to 3 kilometers. It was possible to increase armor thickness, install explosive reactive armor, and improve sights. But the fundamental problem remained. If a shell penetrates, the crew is dead. In the Kharkiv Morozov Machine Building Design Bureau, this was understood better than anywhere else. It was here that the legendary T-34 was once born. It was here that the revolutionary T-64 with composite armor was created. And it was here, in the late 70s, that work began on a tank that was meant to solve the survivability problem radically. Yevgeny followed in his father's footsteps and now faced a task no less ambitious: to create a tank of the future where Soviet crew members would get the same chances of survival as their NATO opponents. Only without increasing the size of the vehicle by 1.5 times, as the Americans did. Several options for a promising tank lay on the designer's tables. Object 490 under the general code name Topol. Object 490A with the code name Buntar. And another project that few people knew about even inside the design bureau. A project so radical that its details were classified even from most employees of the bureau. 3 chances to create a tank of the future. But it is worth starting with the very first one, with the Topol, because that is where this insane story began. Object 490 Topol was the brainchild of Evgeny Morozov, a tank with a crew of 2 people, which was supposed to prove that survivability could be ensured without increasing the size of the vehicle. The idea seemed insane. 2 crew members instead of 3, a commander gunner and a driver. No gunner, no loader. The entire tank consisted of 2 people in an isolated capsule and a set of automatic systems that did everything else. But the most interesting part was not even that. Morozov proposed something that no one in Soviet tank building had done before: a hydro-pneumatic suspension. Instead of the usual torsion bars, a system that could change the tank's clearance right in battle. The tank could squat, reducing its silhouette to 1,600 millimeters, or conversely, rise, increasing cross-country capability on rough terrain. The length of the vehicle was only 6,790 millimeters, more compact than many existing tanks. The suspension solved several problems at once. First, smoothness of ride at high speeds. The tank could rush across rough terrain faster than the T-72 or T-80 without turning the crew into a pulp from constant shaking. Second, changing the pitch of the hull allowed for increased gun elevation and depression angles. The tank could raise its nose or lower its stern, giving the gunner more freedom when firing. Third, a low silhouette meant a lower probability of being detected and hit. The probability of a hit was reduced by 2 times compared to a conventional tank. But the hydro-pneumatic suspension was only the beginning. Morozov understood that in the event of a war with NATO, tanks would fight in conditions where tactical nuclear weapons were used. Radioactive dust, contaminated terrain, and the impossibility of leaving the vehicle for refueling or loading ammunition. A conventional tank in such conditions became a dead piece of iron after a few hours of battle. Fuel ran out, ammunition ended, and the crew faced a choice: go outside and receive a fatal dose of radiation, or sit in the tank and wait for the enemy. The solution was radical. An armored refueling and rearming vehicle on the same chassis as the tank itself, the BZZM, was supposed to accompany tanks in a column, overcome the same obstacles, and pass through contaminated areas. On board, it carried fuel and ammunition for 5 tanks, and most importantly, automatic docking without the crews going outside. The 2 vehicles approach each other, the docking devices connect, and the transfer begins. A full refueling of the tank takes 2 minutes. Loading a full ammunition capacity takes 5 minutes. The crews remain inside in the safety of their armored capsules. This was a revolution in logistics. Tank columns could fight for days without stopping for long refuelings. In the conditions of a nuclear war, when every minute in an open area meant an additional dose of radiation, such a system gave Soviet crew members a chance to survive. NATO had nothing of the kind. American Abrams, British Challengers, all of them required the crew to climb outside for refueling. In a contaminated zone, this was a death sentence. The layout of the Topol was also unusual. The crew of 2 was housed in a capsule. Moreover, both crew members had a full set of controls. If the commander was disabled, the driver could take over fire control. If the driver died, the commander could drive the tank. System duplication increased survivability. A fuel tank was located in front of the crew capsule. It sounds strange, but it was an additional protection. Diesel fuel does not explode from a shell hit, it simply flows out. Instead, the tank worked as an extra layer of armor, absorbing the energy of the shaped charge jet. The tank was isolated and had internal partitions to reduce fuel loss during penetration. Even if a shell penetrated the front armor and the fuel compartment, the crew remained alive. The ammunition capacity was stored in a separate compartment, isolated from people by special partitions. If the shells detonated, the blast wave did not reach the crew. Each compartment of the tank was separated from the others, creating multi-layered protection. A shell had to penetrate several partitions before reaching the people. The tank was supposed to receive the standard active protection complex: 6 launchers, 3 on each side. The system detected incoming anti-tank missiles and shells, fired counter-projectiles toward them, and destroyed the threat on approach. In the 80s, this was science fiction. Active protection existed only in theory and on paper. But Morozov believed that in 10 years, technology would allow the creation of a working system. And he was right. He just did not live to see that moment. The suspension was protected by armored skirts so that fragments and bullets would not damage the hydraulics. A 125mm gun with the possibility of upgrading to 130. An automatic loader of a new type, compact and reliable. Sights of the latest generation with a laser rangefinder. All the most advanced things that existed in the Soviet defense industry of the 80s. On paper, the Topol looked perfect. Compact, survivable, deadly. Two people controlled a machine that could withstand an entire platoon of NATO tanks. The hydro-pneumatic suspension gave incredible mobility. The automatic refueling system allowed fighting in the conditions of a nuclear war. Isolated compartments guaranteed the survival of the crew even if the armor was penetrated. But in October 1984, generals from the GBTU and GRAU arrived in Kharkiv. They looked at the Topol, listened to reports, and studied the blueprints. And then General Litvinenko, head of the scientific committee of the Main Missile and Artillery Directorate, pulled out a diagram. It showed how much more effective a 152mm gun was compared to a 125mm one. The difference was huge. Armor penetration, the destructive effect of a high-explosive fragmentation shell, and effective firing range by all parameters. The 152mm was significantly more powerful. From that moment on, the 152mm caliber was adopted for future USSR tanks, and no one ever returned to this issue. But for the Topol, this meant a death sentence. The tank could not simply be taken and redesigned for such a powerful gun. Meanwhile, another project, Object 490A Buntar, was already being built in metal. Object 490A Buntar was the answer to the main problem of the Topol. 2 crew members is too risky. Kharkiv designers under the leadership of Shomin proposed an alternative layout. 3 people instead of 2, the driver in the hull on the left. Next to him, a fuel tank for 90 liters. The commander and gunner in a low-profile turret, placed one behind the other. But the main innovation was on the outside. The gun was mounted not inside the turret, but on its roof. The externally mounted armament gave several advantages at once. First, the turret became lower, and the tank's silhouette was reduced. Second, it became possible to increase the depression angle of the gun, 8 degrees down. By Soviet standards, this was a breakthrough. Conventional tanks could depress the barrel by 5, at best 6 degrees. Buntar could fire from steeper slopes and could more effectively use terrain irregularities for cover. Third, the turret became more spacious, the crew got more room, and working conditions improved. But these advantages had a price. A gun outside the turret meant that it was exposed to the direct impact of fragments, bullets, and shaped charge jets. Any hit could damage the guidance mechanisms, the stabilization system, or the barrel itself. A conventional tank gun is protected by the massive armor of the turret. Here, there was almost no protection. The developers expected to compensate for this with modular armoring, add-on blocks that could be quickly replaced, but the problem remained. The armor of the Buntar was revolutionary. 10 layers of metal and ceramics, 5 layers of steel, with 4 layers of ceramic inserts between them. The combined protection provided reliable defense against armor-piercing subcaliber shells and shaped charge ammunition. But the main feature was the armoring of the roof, unusually thick, both on the hull and on the turret. This was a defense against plunging artillery fire. NATO was actively developing guided artillery shells that attacked tanks from above, where armor is traditionally weak. Soviet designers took this threat into account. The roof of the Buntar could withstand a hit from a high-explosive fragmentation shell or a cluster munition. The installation of Contact 5 explosive reactive armor was planned. The explosive blocks were to be attached to the front and sides, but the production of prototypes was closed before reaching this stage. There was no reactive armor on the running test rig, but there was a possibility to install it in the future. The design of the hull and turret allowed for it. The armament consisted of a high-power 125mm gun, the 2A66M. A version with a 130mm gun was being developed, but it did not materialize. The mechanized ammunition storage occupied the right part of the fighting compartment. The shells were placed horizontally in 5 rows. The crew was separated from the ammunition by a partition. If the shells detonated, the blast wave did not reach the people. In the future, it was planned to use rounds with a charge of variable shape, abbreviated as ZIF, a revolutionary idea, a charge that could change its configuration depending on the type of target and firing range. This made it possible to create an automatic loader with the maximum density of internal tank volume utilization. More shells in the same space, but the technology was raw and required refinement. The fire control system was called Argus, a main computer connected to a radar, a thermal imaging sight, and television cameras. 2 panoramic sights for the commander and gunner. A night thermal imaging sight was located separately to the right of the automatic loader. Visibility was provided using fiber optic devices placed around the perimeter of the turret. Instead of traditional prism instruments, fiber optics were used. This increased visibility and improved radiation protection. The chassis was created on the basis of the T-64, but with modifications. 7 road wheels per side instead of 6. Shock absorbers on the 1st, 2nd, 6th, and 7th suspension nodes. Hydraulic shock absorbers with a 2-stage characteristic, ensuring a smooth ride at high speeds. Tracks 580 millimeters wide to reduce specific ground pressure. A 6TD3 engine with a capacity of 1,500 horsepower on a tank weighing 48 to 50 tons. This gave a power-to-weight ratio of about 30 horsepower per ton. The estimated speed on a highway was 75 kilometers per hour and 55 kilometers per hour across rough terrain. By 1982, a full-scale wooden mock-up was made to work out the layout. In 1984, they began building the first running prototype. By 1985, 2 prototypes were made, but neither of them could shoot. There was not enough time to bring the weapons system to completion. The gun was in place, and the loading mechanism was installed, but firing trials were not conducted. The second prototype was never completed. Its readiness was less than 50%. After the decision on the 152mm caliber, this was the end for the Buntar. A layout with an external gun could not simply be taken and redesigned for such a powerful weapon. The recoil of a 152mm gun is 3 times stronger than that of a 125mm one. Mounting it outside the turret meant a risk of tearing off the mounts or damaging the guidance mechanisms. A complete rearrangement was needed. Buntar turned into Object 477 Boxer, later renamed Molot. An entirely new layout, a classic scheme with a crew of 3. The gun inside the turret, an elongated chassis based on the T-64 with 8 road wheels. Many technologies carried over from the Buntar: modular armoring, fiber optic observation devices, a hydraulic transmission, and the concept of ammunition isolation. Meanwhile, Evgeny Morozov continued to work on his project. Object 490. Topol also required redesigning for the 152mm gun, and Morozov decided not just to install a new gun, but to create a vehicle the world had never seen before. Morozov took the idea of the Topol and took it to the point of absurdity. Object 490B. Belka became the most radical tank project in the history of the Soviet Union. 4 tracks, 2 turrets, 2 engines, the crew in the stern, everything else in front. 4 tracks gave phenomenal cross-country capability and survivability. Each track had 3 road wheels. The front and rear pairs worked independently. An enemy had to destroy both tracks on one side to immobilize the tank. If it hit a mine, the tank continued to move on the remaining 3. The specific ground pressure became minimal. Belka could pass where other tanks got stuck. 2 engines gave a capacity of up to 2,000 horsepower and redundancy. If one was disabled, the second continued to work. Each had its own final drive gearbox. A hydrostatic mechanical transmission distributed power among the 4 tracks. The armament consisted of 2 turrets. The front one carried a 152mm gun, the 2A-73. An automatic loader with 2 horizontal conveyors held 32 unitary rounds with a length of 1,400mm. A fully automated system allowed firing without crew participation. And this is where the main problem began. The turret stood on a highly sloped frontal armor of 68 degrees. When the turret turned backward, the gun hit the sloped plate and pointed upward. Depression was -5 degrees. Elevation was +10, but only in a range of plus or minus 45 degrees from the longitudinal axis. When turning backward, a blind zone of about 120 degrees was formed. The tank could not fire its main weapon to the rear. In an urban battle, this is a death sentence. The enemy comes from behind, and Belka is helpless. The developers tried to compensate for this with a second turret. Above the crew compartment sat a small turret with a 30mm grenade launcher, 360 degrees horizontally, and from -10 to +45 degrees vertically. It was suitable against infantry and light vehicles. Against tanks, it was useless. 2 TKB 666 machine guns of 7.62mm caliber were on the sides of the stern. Elevation angles were 45 degrees. It was possible to fire at the upper floors of buildings. The ammunition capacity was 1,000 rounds. But even this did not solve the problem of the blind zone. Protection was phenomenal, the equivalent of 2,000 millimeters against armor-piercing shells, and 4,500 against shaped charge shells. The roof was 300 millimeters. But this was achieved not by composite armor, but by successive barriers. 100 millimeters of steel, plus 500 millimeters at an angle. Fuel, engines, ammunition, and multi-layered protection. The fire control system included modular television and thermal imaging sights in the gun mantlet. 1 PN-71, 1 PN-16 Argus instruments, and a panoramic sight on the rear turret. Observation was via video cameras on the hull. No prisms, only screens in the crew capsule. An interesting find was that the gun barrel was used as an air intake pipe during underwater driving. The lift height was 4,600 millimeters when elevated to the stern at 30 degrees. And then came 1991. The USSR was falling apart. The economy was in agony. There was no money for anything. The Kharkiv Design Bureau was suffocating without funding. Projects were frozen, one after another. On March 21, 1991, Evgeny Morozov died. He was 59 years old. He managed to publish his last article in the journal Bulletin of Armored Vehicles, a description of the concept of a promising tank of the 21st century. The article came out after his death in the 7th issue for 91. On December 26, 1991, the Council of Republics of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR adopted a declaration on the termination of the existence of the Soviet Union. The Kharkiv Design Bureau found itself on the territory of independent Ukraine. Funding stopped completely. The world never saw a tank with 4 tracks. No one after the USSR tried to repeat this scheme because everyone realized what Morozov would have realized had he lived to see the trials. A brilliant layout with a fatal flaw remains just a flaw. Beautiful, technological, ambitious, but a flaw. If you like this story about tanks that never fought, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Here we break down the most absurd military hardware that failed precisely because its creators were too smart for their time, too stubborn, or simply did not think about how it would work in a real battle.